France is deciding on its next president, choosing between two candidates with starkly different visions for the country. Centrist Emmanuel Macron is up against the far-right's Marine Le Pen in the second-round contest. The last polling stations are due to close in about 2 hours' time. Official reports say voter turnout was just over 65% at 1500 GMT. CGTN will have all the latest from France across our programs. And for more on this, let's cross over to Paris. I'm joined by Kate Parkinson, who is at Macron's party headquarters, and Dan Williams, who is at Le Pen's party headquarters. Kate, let's begin with you. How has the voting turnout been received by Macron's campaign team, and what is the perceived expectation from the presidential poll?
Well, as you said, voter turnout down. 65% was the figure at 5 p.m. That's a drop of 6% on the last presidential election 5 years ago. Certainly this is something that is worrying for Macron's team, although not hugely surprising. The pollsters were saying when we headed into this vote that they were expecting abstention rates to be at around 25%. The reason it's worrying for Emmanuel Macron's team is because Le Pen's voters are not the ones who will be staying at home today. Her voters are highly motivated to vote for her. The people who are choosing not to vote will be the people who don't want to vote for Marine Le Pen, but equally they're not really sure about Emmanuel Macron, and that could really cost Macron. This is why it's a concern and has been a concern for some time. Certainly the weather not helping. Today's been a particularly rainy day, so that might have prompted people to stay at home rather than heading out to the polling stations. But actually I was talking to one of Macron's campaigners just a few hours ago, and he said really throughout this campaign they've not taken anything for granted, but they're not hugely surprised by this turnout figure as it is, or as it was, I should say, at 5 p.m. And actually, given the fact that Macron has such a commanding lead in the polls, going into this, he was at least 20 percentage points ahead of his rival Marine Le Pen. I would say that it would have to be a shockingly low voter turnout to really shift this and change the end result. Everybody obviously still predicting Macron could win, but as I said, I would think that the turnout would have to be significantly low for that to change and it be a Le Pen victory tonight.
Dan, has the turnout been satisfactory according to Le Pen's supporters? Are they confident of a win?
Well, I can actually also just tell you that in the last few moments, Marine Le Pen has actually arrived here at the headquarters. She arrived a few moments ago. As you can see around me, the world's media are here to witness this evening here in the eastern part of Paris. And certainly there will be a number of supporters arriving. Some will be optimistic, hoping that that somehow the populist movement, that the pollsters were wrong, that they are marching their way towards a famous shock victory. And given the extraordinary nature of this whole election, then one would perhaps not be so surprised. But given the large percentage point difference in the very latest poll that was announced, then that really does probably allow most that will be arriving here the expectation that perhaps this is not going to be their evening. It really hasn't had that groundswell of change over the last week that some have predicted, and therefore most people no doubt will be arriving with perhaps hope, but with low expectations that they will be celebrating this shock victory. But certainly Le Pen herself, in one of her final interviews, did suggest that she could do just that, and in about the next hour or so we will of course find out.
Kate, in the event of a Macron win, what kind of policies would the French be looking at from his leadership?
Well, before we go into that, let's just take a moment to say that if Emmanuel Macron wins this, it will be a remarkable achievement. He would be France's youngest president in modern history. It would also be the first time France has had a president that is not from the two main established parties since the Second World War. So that in itself will be a remarkable moment. When it comes to policies, Macron is very pro-business. He wants to drastically reform France's rigid labour laws. He wants to make it much easier to hire people and fire people. He wants to do this as part of a wider plan to lower unemployment, to boost growth here in France, to boost the stagnant economy here in France. But he's not going to have an easy ride. Certainly when he was economy minister in Francois Hollande's government, the reforms that he was part of then faced massive protests in the streets. He's going to have real issues with France's powerful trade unions if he is elected. And so this is certainly going to be a concern for him, but really before he gets there, he has to get a majority in Parliament, and that's going to be very difficult. His party was only formed a year ago. France will hold legislative elections next month, and certainly Emmanuel Macron plans to field candidates in all 577 legislative districts, and he will need to get a parliamentary majority before he can do anything that he's proposing.
And finally, Dan, what would be the impact of a Le Pen win in the French presidential election?
Well, that is really quite the question, isn't it? If there were to be a Le Pen victory, then the reverberations will of course be felt around France. We saw after that first round of the presidential election the number of protests, there was violence, there was rioting, and that was just a small taster. If this were to go towards Le Pen, then we can expect significantly more of that. But on top of that, of course, the reverberations will be felt all across Europe, of course. Le Pen, a very much known nationalist, she makes no bones about that. She wants to put France first. She wants a referendum on whether to stay within the European Union. She wants to end the Schengen zone. It could potentially end Europe as we know it, certainly the European Union. So obviously the potential of this is to be felt not just in France, across Europe and also across Africa as well. Le Pen is also a known anti-immigration voice. She talks about controlling numbers. She talks about stopping and sending back immigrants as well, and of course especially against any Muslim immigrants too. So on top of all of that, it really, as I say, would have huge consequences, not just within the borders of France, but way beyond as well. Of course, as I say, she arrived a short while ago, and very shortly we will know whether she has indeed done enough to cause what would be an extraordinary shock in this election.
All right, Dan Williams and Kate Parkinson joining us live from Paris. Thank you, both of you.